Well, good evening and welcome to Ratio Christi South Africa. And we welcome all of you this evening for our second day of our online symposium. Delighted that you can join us. For those of you who are listening to these interviews for the first time, Ratio Christi is a student campus ministry, which began in the United States, which has expanded to nations across the globe. And we exist to serve the students and professors, Christian students and professors on campus, to provide good reasons for the Christian worldview and the Christian faith, whether those are historical, philosophical, or scientific arguments, to first of all support and buttress the convictions of Christians on campus, and to, of course, improve the conversation with others who don't have the Christian worldview or share the Christian worldview, and ultimately to have an opportunity to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with people. And so we're an organization that has nearly 150 chapters across the globe. And we currently have 5 chapters here in South Africa. So we have a chapter at Stellenbosch, Rhodes University, University of Pretoria, UKZN, Maritzburg campus, and also Northwest University. My name is Simon Brace. I'm the National Director and also the Chapter Director at Northwest University. And it's my privilege to welcome you to our interview this evening. As like I said, we're part of an online symposium, which is running for 2 weeks. So do visit our website for the full program. You can visit our website at ratiochristi.co.za, where you can find also some free resources we have, ebooks and articles, which we get out there on a weekly basis. So you can avail yourself of those. And also do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hopefully, we can break the 500 subscribers with this online event. But we are also excited about the growing library of interviews with scholars that we've been having in the last, since COVID began, really. And there's a growing library of just outstanding interviews, lectures, and talks on all kinds of topics. So do feel free to take a look at those. And please do recommend us to others, particularly young students, high school students, university students, and others. But of course, this material and the arguments and the truth of these things is there for everybody to avail themselves of. So you can all jump in and to what Ratio Christi has to offer. And also, since we are a student campus organization, we'd ask that you consider praying for us, recommending us, and if you feel led to do so, consider supporting us financially in the work that we do. We'd love to see Ratio Christi chapters established at universities across the continent of Africa, serving Christian students on campuses. All right, this evening, it's my privilege to introduce to you our guest speaker, Dr. Titus Kennedy. Dr. Titus Kennedy is a professional archaeologist currently directing archaeological projects in biblical lands while researching, writing, and teaching in the field of biblical archaeology. He has been involved in excavations and surveys at several archaeological sites in Bible lands, including directing and supervising multiple projects spanning the Bronze Age through the Byzantine period. And he has conducted artifact research and photography at museums and collections around the world. He is a research fellow at the Discovery Institute, teaches as an adjunct professor at Biola University, has been a consultant writer and a guide for history and archaeology documentaries and curricula, and published articles in the field of biblical archaeology and history. His books include Unearthing the Bible and the upcoming Excavating the Evidence for Jesus. And so it's with great delight and tremendous expectation that we welcome Dr. Kennedy to Ratio Christi South Africa. Good evening, Dr. Kennedy. You want to just check your sound there? I think your mic, there's your mic being muted.
Thank you, Simon. It's great to be with you. Good evening, everyone. We're going to begin tonight by looking at archaeology of the Old Testament, and specifically the archaeology of the Exodus. So let me just pull up my PowerPoint here, share the screen with you. All right. That everyone can see that? You can see that, Simon?
Yes, that's great. We're ready to go. That looks great.
Okay, great. Well, the Exodus is a great topic to look at regarding the Old Testament archaeology and reliability of the Bible, because not only is the Exodus one of the most central stories within the Bible, it's mentioned many times throughout both the Old and New Testaments. It connects historically and also theologically. And yet the Exodus is also one of the stories that scholars and even the general public are most skeptical about in the entire Bible. If you were to talk to the majority of ancient historians, archaeologists, Egyptologists, even history teachers, and ask them what their opinion on the Exodus was regarding its historicity, most would say that they think it's myth, that the events never happened. Some might say that, oh, there are a few historical kernels in there, but it's not the way that it's presented in the text of the book of Exodus. Very, very few professional archaeologists in this time would say that the Exodus is historically reliable. And so we're going to investigate that. Now, one of the reasons that scholars are so skeptical of the Exodus is that they claim there's no evidence. So they're saying the absence of evidence has led them to the conclusion that the Exodus didn't happen, or if something similar to the Exodus happened, it was not the way that the Bible depicts it. Let's look at a couple of quotations by some archaeologists. First of all, William Dever, he says regarding the Exodus, not only is there no archaeological evidence for such an Exodus, there is no need to posit such an event. I regard the historicity of the Exodus as a dead issue. Zev Herzog says something similar. He says, the Israelites were never in Egypt, did not wander in the desert. The many Egyptian documents that we have make no mention of the Israelites' presence in Egypt and are also silent about the events of the Exodus. So, what are these basic claims? One, there are no Egyptian texts about the Israelites in Egypt. There are no ancient Egyptian references to the Exodus, the events of the Exodus. And three, there's no archaeological evidence which we could plausibly connect to the events. Those are the claims going on. And so those views would fall into this mythical camp. The Exodus is myth, it's legend, it's unhistorical. Now we really have three different views on the Exodus, three main views. We would have the 15th century BC view. We might call that more traditional, more literal or straightforward, plain reading of the biblical text. We have the 13th century BC, which has some variants, but it would also see at least the type of historical event for the Exodus. And then we have the myth, which again, this is the majority view in scholarship today. And this is based upon, allegedly, the absence of evidence. What about the text of Exodus itself? Well, the oldest copies of the book of Exodus we have come from the Dead Sea Scrolls. 4Q Exodus is dated to about the 3rd century BC. And what we can say about the text of Exodus is that from this early Dead Sea Scrolls until the much later Masoretic text, we have essentially the same text. So the story hasn't changed. But we're looking at when was this composed? When did the events happen? Did they happen? From the Dead Sea Scrolls, we cannot say that the event happened and Moses existed. So we're going to have to look into the archaeology of that and see what kind of evidence there is, because most scholars have just decided it didn't happen. It's not even worth looking into anymore. So that brings us to the geography of the Exodus. We need to have a basic familiarity with this. So we can see that most of the events, they happen in the Northeast Nile Delta region. On this map here, you see a variety of locations that we're going to talk about, such as the archaeological site of Tel El Daba, which also is known as Ramses. Avaris was an earlier name for it. Pithom was in this area, Heliopolis also, some of the lakes and so forth. So I put here on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the land of Ramses is mentioned in Genesis 47:11. We also have another name for this area, the land of Goshen, in Exodus 8:22. Now, in the second section, I've listed of several names, and now all of these we could have ancient Egyptian correlations to. For example, Ramses, the city of Ramses. This is mentioned in Egyptian text. Pithom or Per Atum, Heliopolis, On was or Iono is the ancient Egyptian name. There were fortresses that they called Migdal. Goshen is actually found in ancient Egyptian texts now. Baal Zephon is something that's mentioned later in Exodus 14. We have a plausible identification for that, as well as Pi Hahiroth, and then this Reed Sea also in Egyptian text. So at least the geographical context seems plausible in the scope of ancient Egypt. And were we to do an examination of the writings of the Pentateuch or the books of Moses, the Torah, we would see that there are, in fact, many ancient Egyptian words and names. But that, of course, doesn't tell us that all the events happened. Now that we have looked at the geography, we also need to look at the basic chronology of Exodus. So this is where some debate begins, because if we're not focusing on the Exodus never happened idea, then we're looking at two main camps for the chronology of the Exodus. So we have what you might call the early date and the late date, or the 15th century Exodus and the 13th century Exodus. Now, what are these based off of? A primary passage comes from 1 Kings 6:1, which tells us in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of King Solomon's reign over Israel. All right, so it's saying in the 4th year of King Solomon's reign, that was 479 years after the Exodus occurred, or year 480 in the Exodus era is something that we might phrase it off of. If we take that number literally, then the Exodus from Egypt would have occurred about 1446 BC. There's really not a debate about the reign of Solomon, the dates of Solomon, 967 BC. There are some scholars who have looked into recalibrating a bit of that, but generally scholars, archaeologists agree on the date of Solomon. Now, the 13th century BC view says that these numbers are figurative. One popular explanation of that, such as by Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen, was that it represents 12 ideal generations of 25 years, and so an approximate 300-year period. And of course, if you add 300 to 967, you get 1267. So they're saying 13th century BC approximately in there somewhere. But we have some other passages which would lead us to the idea that this 15th century might be when the Bible really is placing the Exodus. For example, in Judges 11:26, during the reign of the judge Jephthah, it says that Israel had been living in the land for 300 years about, right? Well, Jephthah, it was living around 1100 BC. We add 300 years approximately to that, about 40 years of the wandering. Again, we're getting that same date, 1440s BC. Something else interesting in Numbers 33, 3 through 38, you can see that they are using an Exodus era numbering system, okay? The first year of the Exodus era is mentioned in there. And so we skip ahead to 1 Kings, we see it's the 480th year, the Exodus era. That suggests that they're actually counting real years. And then finally, 1 Chronicles 6:33 through 37. This gives us some generations from Heman the singer in the time of David to Korah, the time of the wandering in Moses, gives us 19 generations inclusive for this period, not 12 generations. And if we were to assign those 25 years to the generations, then we would get much closer to this 480th year type of idea. Now, that may not settle it for people, and certainly we have much more to look into, but we're going to, this evening, focus on this 15th century BC period and see what the archaeological evidence is for that. Is there anything there? Does it connect plausibly? Because, at least in my opinion, one of the reasons that so many scholars have abandoned the Exodus as an historical event is that they were looking at it in a 13th century BC context and not seeing enough evidence for that, not specific evidence that fit. If we do go into the 15th century BC, or approximately 1446 BC date, we fall in conventional Egyptian chronology into the 18th dynasty. So we're going to look at that timeline. Now, before the Exodus ever happened, the Israelites had to get into Egypt. If we look at the sons of Jacob, the sons of Israel, they had been living in Canaan. Of course, Joseph sold into slavery to Egypt. He came over first, and then his family followed. We see in Exodus 1:1, these are the names of the sons of Israel, or Jacob, who came to Egypt with Jacob. So there was a migration of this family. Well, this is something that we do see as plausible during this time period, and we see other examples of it. One of the most interesting comes from the tomb of Khnumhotep II, which is generally dated to around 1870 BC. And if you look at the bottom of the slide there, you see part of the wall painting from inside this tomb. And there's an inscription that goes along with it, and it actually counts 37 people, a group of 37 people migrating from Canaan into Egypt. And one other interesting thing you might notice is that the second person from the right, so if you start at the far right, you move left, the second guy there is wearing this multicolored tunic, similar to what is described for Joseph in Genesis 37:3. But this allowed an easy migration of people from Canaan into Egypt was not something that happened in every time period, but it does fit with this pre-Exodus patriarchal period. Now, once we're in Egypt, one of the major sites to look at is Tel El Daba, which is also known as Avaris or Ramses. And excavations there have been going on for decades, many incredible finds. And for what we're investigating, some of the key points that we could take away, that they had discovered tools and weapons of Canaanite type, or that had come from Canaan, or the material culture was of Canaan, temple architecture and gods from Canaan. So these people who moved there from Canaan, they brought in Canaanite gods and their specific type of architecture. Many sheep remains were discovered of a long-haired sheep variety that had come from Canaan, from the Levant. So again, people moved there from Canaan, they brought their livestock with them, specifically sheep in this case. Much of the pottery, over 20% of it, is of a Canaanite type. So again, they're bringing their material culture, their know-how with them. We have burials of the types found in Canaan, including some burials underneath a house and different burial positions, and the burial goods that are found. And then one specific thing that has been talked about quite a bit actually is a monumental tomb was discovered there with the statue of an Asiatic official, or you might call him a Semitic official, somebody who had come from Canaan, or his family had come from Canaan. You see that on the right there, sort of looks like he's wearing a mushroom hat. This is actually how the Egyptians depicted people from Western Asia with this hairstyle, all right? There's actually another statue that's been discovered there from this time period that's very similar. So we know that there were some people like Joseph who had come from Canaan and actually rose to high levels in the government of Egypt. So generally, contextually, this makes a lot of sense, but that's not necessarily specifics, right? We still need to find some specifics. Well, another thing that is a little bit in between general context and specifics, I think, comes from this idea of the shepherds in the Goshen or Nile Delta region. Not only is this attested by archaeological remains, skeletal remains, but there's an interesting inscription of the Pharaoh queen Hatshepsut, where she talks about how she fixed things in the Delta region, and specifically in Avaris or Ramses. She says that back in the time when the Asiatics were in the midst of the Delta in Avaris with vagrants, and some have translated this as shepherds or sheep herders in their midst, toppling what had been made. They ruled without the sun. So she's saying that before she fixed things, there were these Asiatics, people that had come from Canaan, who were living in the Delta region. Specifically, they were living in the city of Avaris or Ramses. And there was this other kind of lesser group of people. Maybe they were a lower class, but they held livestock. They were shepherds. And then she also says that these people ruled without the sun, which I think we can connect to them not worshiping the sun god Ra. So they worshiped a different god or different gods. Now, she could be talking about Israelites specifically. She could be talking about people from Canaan in general, to which the Israelites belong. But this certainly fits the description that we see when Jacob and his family moved to Goshen. Now let's get into some more specifics, because the claim is that there's no evidence that Israelites lived in Egypt prior to the Exodus. Israelites, Hebrews, okay, we can use either kind of terminology. What is it that would tell us that Israelites or Hebrews lived in Egypt? It's not material culture, because we can't get that specific with tribal affiliations, right? The Israelites use the same kind of pottery as other people from Canaan. Their religious practices may have been different, but it could be hard to distinguish that archaeologically in a city, in just a residential dwelling. So names are actually something that can be very specific for us. At Avaris or Ramses, the site of Tel El Daba, 9 of these scarab seals, like you see on the right, have been found with the name Jacob El or Jacob El. And many of these have actually been found in other areas, including Canaan. But what this does is it shows us the specific usage of the name Jacob in Egypt during the time of Jacob and Joseph. It doesn't necessarily attest to the Jacob of the Bible, but it tells us that that name was in use. And that's a name that we see as the father, the patriarch of the Israelite or Hebrew people. Secondly, another artifact that was discovered in the context of the tomb workers down in the south near Thebes, the cemetery or necropolis of Thebes. This is again the pre-Exodus period. There is an ostracon, which is a piece of pottery with writing on it, with the name Yushe or Jesse. So this also, of course, is a Hebrew name that we see slightly later. Then we have the Papyrus Brooklyn, which I think is one of the more important and significant artifacts that we have for this pre-Exodus period. Now, the Papyrus Brooklyn comes from the 13th dynasty. So we might say beyond the pre-Exodus period that this is sort of the period of Joseph, or the transition between Joseph and Moses. Certainly there are Israelites, or supposed to be Israelites, living in Egypt at this time. And this papyrus, for many people, would be rather mundane. It just lists all these household servants or slaves in the Thebes area. 95 names are preserved. As you can see, it's in fragmentary condition. 37 of these are identified as Semitic. Hebrew is part of the Semitic language family. And it has their foreign or original name listed, and then it has their new Egyptian name listed, which is the same situation that we see with Joseph getting renamed in Genesis 41:45. Now, what are some of the names on here of particular interest to us right now with the Exodus? We have several biblical Hebrew names found on this papyrus. For example, Menahema, which would be a feminine form of Menahem. Asherah, feminine form of Asher. Who's Asher? Well, the first Asher we know of, he was one of the sons of Jacob. We have the name Shiphrah. That's found in Exodus chapter 1. It's name of one of the midwives in Exodus. We have Akoba, which seems to be a feminine form of the name Jacob or similar to it. There's the name Job, which this may not be a Hebrew name, although we do find it, of course, in the Old Testament. Sekera seems like a feminine name similar to Issachar. We have this compound name, which includes David, Dawidi. We have Esebto, which this is a Hebrew name. It's actually not attested in the Old Testament, but it comes from the word for herb, and it is a Hebrew name. Then we have Chaya. That's the name Eve. And then finally, we have this name Hebrew, which appears to be an Egyptian rendering of the word or name or designation Hebrew. Now, on the papyrus, these are all written in Egyptian hieratic, all right? So they're not using the alphabetic script. That's why some of the spelling might seem a little bit different. There's some language transition, but these are clearly Hebrew names that we find in the Old Testament. And so I really don't think that we can ask for more specific evidence than something like that in terms of establishing that there were Hebrews living in Egypt before the Exodus. Here's a list of those names with biblical reference where you can find that name. So Jacob, Jesse, Menahem, Asher, Shiphrah, Issachar, David, Esebto, Chaya, Eve, and Hebrew. And I put Job out there as perhaps this isn't a Hebrew name. But in any case, we have examples of several biblical Hebrew names. Now, what about the rest of the story? So if we could say it looks like there were Hebrews living in Egypt in this pre-Exodus period, we even have some in the classification of servants. What happened next? Well, Exodus tells us in chapter 1, verse 8, that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So Joseph dies, and then eventually another Pharaoh comes to power who didn't know him. I think the most plausible candidate for this would be Pharaoh Ahmose I. He came from the south. He drove out the Hyksos rulers in the north. He restored native Egyptian rule and reunified Egypt, beginning this 18th dynasty around 1570 BC. Now, when this new dynasty started, slavery in Egypt increased and became much more common, especially of Asiatics, people from Western Asia, those from Canaan. In fact, the Egyptian word Amu, which it was for Asiatic, became synonymous basically with slave in this period because they essentially thought every person who is from the Canaan region, who's Asiatic as they called them, was a slave. And much of the reason for this is that the Egyptians were basically getting revenge on these people who they saw as they'd come in and taken over half of their country for over a century. And so then we have also in Exodus the enslavement of the Hebrews starting then, and this is prior to the birth of Moses. So a little chronology here. We have Joseph dying. We have 1570 BC, Ahmose I reunites Egypt, establishes the 18th dynasty. We have the more enslavement of Asiatics. And then about 1526 BC, we would have the birth of Moses. The slide there, by the way, shows the Egyptian classification of some different groups of people aligned to the points of the compass for them. So the second from the left, that is what they would classify as an Asiatic or Canaanite type person. So they really didn't get more specific than just saying Asiatic, person from Canaan. So we actually can't expect to rereading Egyptian texts and them saying, oh, it's the clan of the Israelites or the tribe of the Israelites. They just didn't get that specific with these people. They didn't care that much. They're enslaving many of them anyway. And they are very centered, of course, on their own kingdom. So we have enslavement going on. Now, in Exodus 1:11, it tells us that part of the forced labor that the Israelites were subjected to was to build these storage facilities for the Egyptians And it says that that happened at the cities of Ramses and Pithom, and the Septuagint of Exodus 1 also adds in Heliopolis or On. So what's been found? First, let's look at Ramses or Avaris. Now, the excavator there, BTAC, he notes that in his excavations, they found, after the Egyptian conquest of Avaris, so this is in the 18th dynasty, where we're saying the Exodus may have happened, enormous storage facilities were set up. Among them were numerous silos, and a new palatial compound of the 18th dynasty was constructed. This is very important. So they found storage facilities there that had been constructed, newly constructed, and a royal palace. Well, we see both of those things discussed in Exodus. The 18th dynasty palace that he talks about, we know even more specific things about this. For example, it was used specifically during the reign of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II in this 15th century BC era. Was this the palace of the Exodus Pharaoh that's talked about, for example, in Exodus chapter 7? Perhaps. I mean, it fits many of the properties of it. It's up in the Delta region. It's right on the Nile River. We're going to look at some more things connected to that. Other points of excavation, which we talked about briefly before, they found evidence of shepherds. Many pits and many burials of both sheep and goats have been excavated around Avaris and Ramses. And why is this important? Of course, we see in Genesis and in Exodus 12:5 that the Israelites were raising lambs, using lambs, but this is not something that the Egyptians did. If you go read through ancient Egyptian texts of this period or look at their artwork, you're not seeing sheep there. So we know that these aren't Egyptian people that are tending to these sheep. Now, one of the big objections that people have about a 15th century BC Exodus is the name of this city, Ramses. And they say that this situates the Exodus in the 13th century BC because Ramses II. Ramses II established his capital there. Well, Ramses II certainly did do that, and he did have more building done at this site, but it was in existence prior to Ramses II, and he doesn't hold a monopoly on the name Ramses. So what is the name Ramses? In Egyptian, it means born of Ra. Other English spellings or renderings of it, sometimes Ramos, we see there Ramses with not two S's but one. There are actually a lot of people with the name Ramses in ancient Egypt. We know that the name is attested at least as early as the end of the Second Intermediate Period or the beginning of the 18th dynasty. For example, Ramos, son of Ahmose I, in the early 16th century BC, also Ramos, father of Senenmut, in the early 16th century BC. So this name was used even before the time of Moses, all right? So it was around. It's not a problem that the name Ramses is used before the time of Ramses II. By the way, Ramses II's father, he had the same, grandfather had the same name. This city, P. Ramses, it was used before the time of Ramses II also. The Pharaoh Horemheb, Seti I, Ramses I, okay? Many decades prior to Ramses the Great or Ramses II, right? So that's really shouldn't be an issue. Also, we have the possibility that this name was updated in the text of Exodus later on. And we actually have many examples of things like that in the Old Testament where the name of a city changed, and so they updated it so that the later readers actually knew where this was. So I wouldn't say that the name of the city being Ramses is something that really binds us to a 13th century Exodus. It has many possibilities. What about Pithom? Well, Pithom comes from the Egyptian Per Atum, meaning house of Atum. Now, this can be just referring to a temple of the god Atum. And it doesn't always have to be referring to a city, but it seems that there was actually a city, or perhaps even more than one, with this name. For example, we have ancient Egyptian records from the time of Horemheb in the late 14th century BC that he carried out construction at a place called Per Atum or Pithom. So archaeologists, Egyptologists have generally identified Pithom with one of two archaeological sites, Tel El Maskuta or Tel El Rataba. So Maskuta was occupied earlier on in this pre-Exodus period, for sure. Then after that, it seems like it had a long period of vacancy. Could the Israelites have built at that site in this sort of early enslavement period before the time of Moses? It seems like that could have been possible. The other site, Rataba, however, which is not too far away, only about 12 kilometers, 13 kilometers west, it doesn't seem to have evidence of earlier building. So there's a temple built during the time of Ramses II. There's a city wall, some mud brick buildings, and so forth. Some archaeologists actually think that the site migrated. So it was in Maskuta first, and then it migrated over to Rataba and retained the name, which occasionally this happens. But we're not 100% sure on this, but it's a real location at least, and there's good possibility that this Maskuta site is the one that is mentioned in Exodus chapter 1. Then finally, we have Heliopolis or On. Now, this is basically in the Cairo suburbs today, and there is excavation that has been going on there. So they're in the process of uncovering more and learning more about it. But we do know that it was occupied in biblical time periods, the patriarchal period, time of Jacob, Joseph, Moses, into the Exodus period. All right, so it fits in terms of the timeline. And there was construction, building that was done there in this pre-Exodus Hebrew enslavement period, like during the reign of Thutmose III. He talks about a temple being built to encircle, or excuse me, a wall being built to encircle a temple. So that fits the general context there. But of course, what we saw at Avaris and Ramses, that seems much more specifically connected to what we read in Exodus. In terms of the slavery idea, we have a variety of sources. One papyrus from probably the middle of the 15th century BC talks about immigrant people. Again, we're talking about Asiatics, Semites, who were made slaves. They were compelled to do labor after the expulsion of the Hyksos. And when Ahmose the First came in, established this new dynasty. All right, so there was this long period of enslavement. They had to build public buildings for the Pharaoh. Again, the Hebrews are not mentioned specifically, but we don't have other tribes or clans mentioned either. So that's not something we should expect. There's artwork, though, that depicts this too, like from the tomb of Rekhmirah. He was a vizier of Egypt during the time of Moses, pre-Exodus, Exodus period. And if you look at the wall painting, starting on the left, kind of in that bottom panel, you can see some Semitic and Nubian slaves who are making these mud bricks or clay bricks. So they're taking the material, they would mix it with straw, they put it in a frame, they stack it out in the sun. And then as you follow to the right, they're actually taking these bricks, and if we saw more of the panel, they are building buildings with them. Mud brick was a major building component in ancient Egypt. You can see here today, it's actually, this process is still used in many of the villages. So straw is combined with it to make it hold together. We read Exodus 5, 6 through 8, it talks about this brick making process. And it says that the Israelites were no longer given straw to make brick as previously. They had to go get it themselves. So it made their job harder. But it says but the quota of bricks which they were making previously you shall impose on them. So they still had to make as many bricks, they just had more work to do. Well, we see a parallel in this. It comes from an artifact called the Louvre leather roll from the reign of Ramses II, the early 13th century BC. Same kind of thing is going on here, just a bit after the Exodus. And it talks about, again, a quota of mud bricks. It says that 1,630 arrived. They had a deficit of 370. And they explain this as the slaves could not gather the required amount of straw, and they were punished, they were beaten because of it. Exactly what we see in the book of Exodus. Now, when we get to the time of Moses and his birth, there is an interesting possible connection between Moses and the princess turned Pharaoh queen Hatshepsut. So who was she? Well, she was a princess of the 18th dynasty who ended up ruling as a pharaoh in her own right for over 20 years during this co-regency of Thutmose III. So she was the daughter of a pharaoh, and when her husband died, she took over as pharaoh. And this happened more than once in Egyptian history, but it wasn't extremely common. Now, something important about her also is that she was the only child of her parents to survive past infancy. So we're looking at the only child of the royal house who was alive at that time, at this kind of birthplace and early childhood time of Moses. Females of royal birth during her period, the 18th dynasty, were called daughter of the king. We see daughter of Pharaoh used in Exodus 2:5. So at least the chronology would overlap here with the way we're structuring things anyhow, with Hatshepsut being the one who would take Moses from the Nile. But what other reasons might we have for associating her with that princess or daughter of Pharaoh? Well, later on, something interesting happens to Hatshepsut's monuments. They were destroyed. Her images were smashed. They were erased. She was essentially at least they tried to erase her from Egyptian history. You can see in the picture on the right, for example, there's nothing in between these two deities, right? Well, originally there was an image of Hatshepsut there, but during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep II, it seems like he started having her images and her names wiped out. And actually, we see many places where he would wipe out her name and then he would put his name in that place or the name of his queen. And so Egyptologists have come up with various explanations for why this might have been. Usually they say that she must have done something horrible. Maybe it was because she was a female pharaoh and that disturbed the regular order of Egypt. But they don't know exactly why, because there's no ancient Egyptian record explaining that. But if she was the one who saved Moses from the Nile and adopted him, that would be reason for a backlash from this Exodus Pharaoh. Because if she hadn't saved Moses, well, maybe none of that stuff would have happened. And so that brings us to the plagues. Obviously, the plagues are a very important component of the Exodus story. They're well known, but usually scholars would say there's no record of anything like that in ancient Egypt. And we could counter that with, well, we wouldn't expect the Egyptians to put such a failure in their official records, because in the ancient world, the kings, the records of the royal houses, whether it be Egypt or Assyria, they didn't put their losses and failures in the official annals. They only put their wins, and they tried to even make draws or losses. They'd spin them like propaganda. But there is one ancient Egyptian papyrus not an official document of the king, that might be talking about this period of the plagues. And that is sometimes called the Dialogue of Ipuwer and the Lord of All. So there's only one copy of this that's ever been discovered. And it's basically a poetic lamentation. Its author is identified by the name Ipuwer. And he is essentially telling about some of these events, lamenting them, and he's questioning and critiquing someone called the All Lord. This seems to be the god Ra, and the Pharaoh. And he's doing this in response to these terrible things that have happened in Egypt. And generally we see death, destruction, disruption of the natural order, and the gods and the Pharaoh powerless in this text. But there are some specific things we'll look at in just a minute. But the date of composition for this papyrus has often been a problem for many people, because they say, okay, look, it looks thematically like it has connections to the Exodus plagues story. In fact, who might be the foremost expert in the world on this papyrus actually says in one of his publications that he sees the linguistic and thematic links between the Dialogue of Ipuwer and the Exodus plagues, but he says that really is irrelevant because both texts are unhistorical, and so there can't be any connection between actual events since nothing happened. All right. So some facts about this. Earliest and only copy is from the 13th century BC. All right. So comes after the Exodus, so it's writing about something before that time, could be in the Exodus period. But most scholars date its original composition, so the original writing of it, to the second intermediate period. We might put that as around 1850 to 1600 BC, just broadly. All right, so that would be earlier than the Exodus, right? Some put it in the Middle Kingdom, even earlier. Some even put it even earlier in the first intermediate period. Now, why did they do that? So the presupposition is that this is an allegory describing just the mood or the theme of the chaotic intermediate periods, and it's not recording any historical events. So that's been a generally accepted and published idea about this. However, if we were to analyze the linguistics, many of the words and phrases that are used in this text, we would see that they actually come into use in the 18th dynasty. And so at the very least, we would have to say that, oh, it must have been rewritten, the language was rewritten in the 18th dynasty. But we could also plausibly say maybe it was actually composed in the 18th dynasty and they just copied it as it was. Also, the name Ipuwer appears in a text of the Hatshepsut, Thutmose III period, so just this pre-Exodus kind of Moses period. And Ipuwer, there's a tomb inscription that talks about Ipuwer, and he was a famous bard, so basically a poet who put things to music. So he was fairly well known, and we might say maybe this poem was sung by people. Now, why have there been previous claims connecting this Ipuwer papyrus to the Exodus plagues? Well, there's a number of things that are described in the papyrus that have very interesting parallels to the plagues account. The most noticed is the river is blood and blood is everywhere. All right, the river is blood, Nile River turning to blood. That's a huge one. But if that was the only one, we might just say it could be a coincidence, and maybe it's some kind of figurative language. But there are many other things. So he talks about the land being injured. So there's a lot of destruction of the land going on. Pestilence is throughout the land, plague and pestilence. So some kinds of plagues, some kinds of pestilence. There are various things that happen in the plagues account in Exodus that could be referred to in that way. Talks about cattle weeping and moaning. All right, so there's pain of even the animals, the cattle, and death. Talks about humans who are having their hair falling out and are in such extreme pain that they desire death. We might think of something like the boils. Trees and plants are destroyed, food gone, all right? So something is destroying all these plants and crops. Fire in some cases, actually, and talked about in the poem. Children of different classes have died, all right? There could be various reasons for that, but we see death of people and children specifically. One line talks about how day does not dawn on it, the land of Egypt. So again, if this connects to the plagues, we could be associating this with the days of darkness. The sun is not rising there. The king is removed, the palace is fallen. So something about the Pharaoh being powerless. Something's happened in the palace. The power of Ra, the sun god, is not seen. Again, this could be connected to the days of darkness. Also, it could be generally that it just seems like the Egyptian gods are absent, all this bad stuff is happening. And generally, throughout a section of the poem, he talks about how the gods of Egypt are absent or powerless. So they're doing nothing. It's like all this bad stuff's happening. Where are the Egyptian gods? And then finally, we have the servants taking and wearing gold, silver, and precious stones, which sounds very much like what we see at the end of that plagues narrative, where the Israelites get these gold, jewelry, etc., and they take it with them and leave Egypt. So I would say that we at least have a plausible case that this could be a poetic, unofficial version of the time period of the Exodus plagues. Now, that final plague was the death of the firstborn. And there's another interesting connection in Egyptian history to this. And that comes from the dream stele of Thutmose IV. The dream stele was found in between the paws of the Sphinx. It was made much, much later than the Sphinx originally was. But he was the son and successor of Amenhotep II, who I would suggest is the Exodus Pharaoh. And it basically tells us that he received a divine promise or a divine endorsement that the kingship would be given to him, not his older brother, who was the expected heir. So here's a section of the text there, and it starts off, one of those days it came to pass that the king's son, Thutmose, came. All right, so in the middle of the day, he comes and he goes to the Sphinx and he falls down and sleeps there, and he has this dream. And the god tells him that I will give you my kingdom upon earth at the head of the living. You will wear the white crown and the red crown upon the throne of Geb, the hereditary prince. The land will be yours. All right. And then he mentions that which the eye of the all-Lord shines upon. There's that all-Lord again mentioned. So the gods, they're giving him this promise. He's going to be the Pharaoh. Why does he need to do that? Well, again, we look in the Egyptian history, he had an older brother. His older brother was named Amenhotep. He would have been the Pharaoh, but he just disappears from Egyptian history. The records that we have don't say what happened to him. So presumably he died. Again, we don't have Egyptian records that say how that happened, but Thutmose IV, he wasn't supposed to become the next Pharaoh. And so he gets this divine promise fabricated in order to make his ascension as king to look more legitimate. A little bit more about this Exodus Pharaoh and Moses. So first that we might notice in the book of Exodus that the Pharaoh or the king, he's never specified by name, which is why we kind of have to take some guesses or hypotheses about who the Exodus Pharaoh might be. The book of Exodus just calls these kings of Egypt Pharaoh. And it seems to be intentional because this practice is actually attested in texts of the enemies of Egypt during this time period. So basically they wouldn't honor the Pharaoh by giving his name. They would just call him Pharaoh or King of Egypt. This title, Pharaoh, is derived from Per-Aa, great house, meaning great house. And that it actually only came into use for the king of Egypt during the 18th dynasty, during this pre-Exodus period. Thutmose III actually seems to be probably the earliest attested use of it, referring to the king of Egypt. So it's kind of interesting correlations for the historical context there. Now, the Pharaoh who was in power before the Exodus must have had a reign of over 40 years. And so this helps us narrow some things down. Thutmose III, he reigned for 54 years. He's actually one of only a few pharaohs in Egyptian history with a reign of 40 plus years. So if he was the pre-Exodus pharaoh, his son, Amenhotep II, would be the Exodus pharaoh. And again, at the chronology and the scheme that we're looking at, that's what we would expect. Amenhotep II fits into that Exodus pharaoh time period. The Exodus pharaoh also recently came into power. Amenhotep II took the throne only a few years prior to this proposed time of the Exodus, the 1446 BC Exodus. So what else might lead us to suggest Amenhotep II is the pharaoh of the Exodus? Well, he was incredibly arrogant, and scholars of ancient Egypt have noticed this. There's some examples here. He claims that he could shoot arrows through a copper target as thick as a palm. All right, not really possible. He said that he could row a ship faster and farther than 200 Egyptian sailors. This is by himself, so he's basically like Superman. He talks about how he single-handedly killed 7 prince warriors of Kadesh, and he also talks about how the kings of all these foreign nations like Babylon, the Hittites, Mitanni, came to pay tribute to him. And he also allegedly conducted the largest slave raid in Egyptian history. So he kind of fits the psychological profile of the Exodus pharaoh. But there's also a military decline that happens during his reign. So earlier in the 18th dynasty, the military of Egypt seemed to be extremely powerful. In fact, his father conducted 17 known campaigns, and he extended the influence of Egypt. But then we get to Amenhotep II. After the beginning of his reign, there are almost no military expeditions of the Egyptians for about 100 years or so. And if you read through the Amarna letters in the sections where the Canaanite mayors or kings are always saying, send troops, send archers, send help to Canaan, the Egyptians never do it seems, because they just keep asking and nothing ever happens. So why did they never send troops to help solidify their vassals in Canaan? Seems like they were lacking the military power. Well, during the time of Amenhotep II, that Delta palace at Ramses or Avaris was also abandoned. We don't know exactly why from the archaeology, but the excavators says that a possibility is there was some kind of plague there, okay? So something serious happened that caused them to abandon that, all right? Now, another important point, because some people have an issue with this in terms of a 15th versus 13th century BC Exodus. The book of Exodus does not tell us that the whole city of Avaris or Ramses or the other cities that are mentioned were abandoned, that everybody in the whole population left those cities. It was just the Hebrews and some people, what the Bible calls the mixed multitude, went with them and left, all right? So we shouldn't expect to see the abandonment, the entire abandonment of these cities. It's just part of the population that goes. Now that slave raid to Canaan that I mentioned earlier, this is also very interesting. So Amenhotep II, he claims that during a campaign in about 1445 BC, very soon after the Exodus, that he went to Canaan and he brought back this huge amount of slaves and chariots and weapons and gold and so forth. So he says that he took back 101,128 prisoners, over 1,000 chariots, over 13,000 weapons, gold and silver chariots, etc. This is found, for example, on the Memphis stele of Amenhotep II. If you were to look at other Egyptian military campaigns where they took captives, it's so much less. One of the other biggest ones is 5,903. And so scholars have said he's grossly exaggerating. But that I don't think is even the main point here for our purposes. It's that it seems like he is trying to save face and say that, oh, I replenished the slave supply. All these slaves left, got kicked out, escaped, however they framed it. But he went back and either he got them back, maybe he said that, or he just got some new ones that were better. So he's trying to replenish a huge slave population. He makes this exaggerated claim. It happens right after the Exodus. He also talks about chariots and weapons. Well, if they had lost so many of their chariots and their warriors in the sea, then they would need to replenish some of that military hardware. All right, now what about some Egyptian sources that talk about the Exodus or might talk about the Exodus? Well, we do have one. Now, it doesn't come from the 18th dynasty, 19th dynasty, etc. It comes much later, but it is an Egyptian source. So it's Manetho. He was an Egyptian priest and historian who lived in the 4th and 3rd century BC. Yes, this was about 1100 years after the Exodus, but he was an ancient Egyptian. He also had access to sources that we no longer have. And he does, in fact, identify an exodus of the Israelites. Some of the things he says, that the Egyptians came to an agreement that these people should leave Egypt. And he says they went away with their whole family and their effects. And it says they went through the wilderness to Syria. All right, so this is the region of Canaan. They built in that city a country which is now called Judea. They called the city Jerusalem. So we know he's talking about Israelites there. Israelites were in Egypt. They left in some mass migration. Another thing he says is that the Pharaoh during that time was named Amenephis. This is the Greek rendering of Amenhotep. So that's the same name of this Pharaoh, Amenhotep II, that we've been talking about. So again, that seems to fit. Now, after the Israelites exit Egypt, they go to this wandering. One of the places we see them go is called Dovka. And in the itinerary there, it says they go from the wilderness of Sin, camp at Dovka, Alush, Rephidim, and then the wilderness of Sinai, Numbers 33. There are turquoise mines in this area. One of the famous places is called Sarabit el-Kadim. It actually is where they found all these proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, so early alphabetic inscriptions in a Semitic language using Egyptian hieroglyphs. But it seems like the Egyptian name for this area, which we would translate as land of turquoise, actually was rendered into Hebrew as Dovka, and it's put in this itinerary there. And so, again, there's some historical context. I mention this because a lot of people say, well, maybe there's some evidence for parts of the Exodus, but there's nothing about the wandering. But we actually have one of the most important pieces of evidence connecting to the Exodus that is part of the wandering period. And that is an inscription that mentions the Nomads of Yahweh. This comes from a temple that was dedicated both to the god Amun-Ra and to Pharaoh Amenhotep III. It was built about 1400 BC. It's in Soleb, Sudan, which at that time was part of Egypt, ancient Egypt in the 18th dynasty. There are columns, and there's a list on a wall that names people and places that were supposedly subjugated by the Pharaoh Amenhotep III. And one of those groups of people are identified by this phrase. He talks about the land of the nomads of Yahweh. So the place where these nomads of Yahweh were wandering around. This is found both on a column, and it was also found as part of the wall list inside the temple. Again, this temple was constructed around 1400 BC by Pharaoh Amenhotep III. The geographical context of that inscription, if we look at where the others are situated, places them somewhere east of Egypt in this kind of Edom, Moab, or possibly Canaan area. So that fits geographically where the Israelites would be during this wandering period after the Exodus. So we have some passages like in Numbers where it talks about how the sons of Israel were the people of Yahweh, or how Yahweh made Israel wander in the wilderness. We also see that in Exodus 7:5, that one of the reasons for the plagues was so that the Egyptians will know that I'm Yahweh. So what does this inscription tell us? Well, it tells us the Egyptians and even the Pharaoh were familiar with the name Yahweh, the God Yahweh, and that they associated this particular group of nomads with that God. Well, in ancient times, there were no other groups of people who talked about Yahweh, who worshiped Yahweh. In fact, this is the earliest inscription mentioning Yahweh that's ever been discovered. And if we look at, again, some more context to this, it's the end of the 15th century BC. Moses didn't learn the name Yahweh until the 15th century BC. And then we have this popping up on an Egyptian temple during the wandering period, talking about nomads or wanderers. It seems to be that this can only be talking about the Israelites during the wandering period. So then they eventually show up in Canaan. We don't have time to talk about that this evening. But after that, we start to see some inscriptions mentioning Israel and Canaan, like the Manetho stele, and some archaeological evidence connected to the conquest and settlement. So in summary, we've got Semites or Asiatics in Egypt prior to the Exodus. We have specifically biblical Hebrew names in Egypt prior to the Exodus, including some that are slaves and servants. The site of Avaris or Ramses, where these kinds of people are living. We've got mass slavery, mud bricks, public building projects, including things like those storage facilities at Ramses or Avaris. We have Ipuwer and this possible poetic account of the time of the plagues. We have the abandonment of the Nile Delta Palace. We've got Amenhotep II, his psychological profile, his alleged slave raid, the decline of the Egyptian military. We've got the defacing and attempted erasure of Hatshepsut, possibly for her association with Moses. Tutmosis IV makes his divine promise of kingship because he wasn't the expected heir. And then finally, the wandering, we have these nomads of Yahweh. So I think we could actually say that rather than there being absolutely no evidence of the Exodus, that we have several items which suggest the historical reliability of the Exodus story, and that these events actually did happen, and they happened the way that they were written down in Exodus. And we shouldn't be skeptical or just throw out the book of Exodus as some allegory or myth. If you want to look more into some of the artifacts connected to the Exodus and other periods of the Bible, I have a book that came out last year that just focuses on artifacts. You can check that out on Amazon. It's also available on Kindle. And now I think we will get into the Q&A session.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Cannon. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks so much, Asian. It's got a lot of information. We've got a number of questions rolling, but before I get to some of the questions that come on YouTube, I just want to have a few more just to ask, kind of give us some more background. Then, first of all, who's I've done a little bit now, but maybe just explain to us where they came down, and do you think that they were also enslaved along the they will have been part of that mixed crowd of them, at least? I don't know.
I couldn't hear all of that. Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Okay, so the question was, can you explain to us who the Hyksos as a group?
All right.
And do you think that they were enslaved with the and were perhaps part of the mix who were able to get out?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the Hyksos, it seems, this was the name It's actually a Greek rendering of the Egyptian name, but in Egyptian, it meant rulers of foreign lands. And so it seems to be their way of talking about the ruling class of these Semites or people that had come over from Canaan and were in power in northern Egypt during this second intermediate period. And then the Pharaoh, almost the first, he comes there and he comes to northern Egypt and he fights them and he kicks them out and chases them back into Canaan. So as far as the ruling class and this Hyksos people, it seems like they actually were pushed back into Canaan. And then you had a large population of, maybe you can call this the lower classes or the regular people who were still in Egypt. And so I would guess that the Hyksos weren't really part of the enslaved population because they were kicked out of Egypt, and then other people were left and stuck there.
Okay. What is the kind of the skeptics view of the Exodus? Look at the biblical account, just to be occasion. Who are then? Do they take? What purposes would they fabricate the story? See how the critics typically deal with this. You said if they think that this happened to after the fact, then they've got to give at least some account. What account of the Exodus?
Yeah, I think most would say that it was basically an invented origin story. And the odd thing about it, though, is that it's not a very impressive origin story to say, we were slaves and then we escaped from this land and wandered in the wilderness for 40 years and our God was punishing us. But that would be the general consensus, is that it was an invented origin story, and they had to say that they came from somewhere. Basically, some scholars would say, all right, there's no connection to Egypt whatsoever realistically, and others would say maybe there was some kind of migration of Semites out of Egypt and they pulled that legend.
Okay. All right. So it's they invented the story about them. And what are their reasons to give them an identity as a group or a nation? Is that the reason why they make that argument?
Right. So, yeah, as a distinct group, and you could even say a distinct group that had a connection to a specific god. So, generally, archaeologists today would usually say that the Israelites emerged out of the Canaanite population. They were living in Canaan, and they had some different beliefs that they came up with, and so they started their own subculture and eventually developed their own nation out of this. And so then they needed a better story than that, would be the way to explain it. And so they say, oh yeah, they were actually this completely different group that came from Egypt and conquered the land, and they actually were not so closely connected to the Canaanites.
Okay. Some more. Yeah, there was one question was just pull up the YouTube channel. Yeah, that for you. All the dating, but it does prove that the Israelites were in Egypt. One could just have a certain nation of Semitic king in Egypt. Aren't you there fighting the case? That was the question.
Okay, let's see.
Did you catch that? Would you like me to?
Yeah, repeat that, please. I'm getting a little bit of cutting out.
Just got no, I get the question then. All this data is interesting. Not prove that the Israelites, one could just have a certain explanation of Semitic being in Egypt. Aren't you therefore overstating this?
Okay. All right. Yeah, we can see from the archaeological evidence that we've got Semitic people in Egypt, right? But what else did we look at? We saw these specific biblical Hebrew names as some of the people that were living there in Egypt. And so I think that even if we're not looking at some of the connections of the story to Egyptian texts and archaeology, that the presence of Hebrew people by their Hebrew names in Egypt tells us that Hebrews or Israelites were in Egypt. Again, we're not going to get anything closer than that. I mean, if people are saying we need more evidence, what are we going to get? Like a Egyptian official text that is documenting the names of all the different tribes of people that they have enslaved in Egypt. I mean, that's just not something that the Egyptians did. So we wouldn't expect them to say Israelites were here. And what if we did? Then I guarantee that the explanations of some scholars would be like, oh, that's not the Israelites of the Bible. That's a different word, or it's the proto-Israelites. They're not the same people. I mean, again, we have this Nomads of Yahweh inscription, right? There's no way that we could connect that with another group. There's just zero evidence connecting Yahweh with any other group of people in the ancient world like that. So I think the burden is on explaining why there are Hebrew people in Egypt and why they're Yahweh worshiping nomads, and it's not the Israelites.
Just talk about that the mention of Yahweh. When was logical discovery, and what do the say about that nomads of Yahweh evidence that?
So that temple was actually discovered or rediscovered in the 1800s, but they didn't do anything with it until there were excavations starting in the late 1950s. And then some of it was documented, some of it was not. Actually, one of the reasons I went there was to look at all the inscriptions firsthand and photograph them, because we couldn't find any photographs of the actual nomads of Yahweh inscription. There was a kind of sideways obscured one in the excavation report, and that was it. Then they did some drawings. But what do scholars say about this? Well, you could go back to Donald Redford's book, Israel, Egypt, and Canaan in Ancient Times, and he mentions it there. And his interpretation of it is that it's talking about the same Yahweh that's in the Old Testament. Okay, again, we don't have Yahweh mentioned by any other people as their God or anything like that. And there's no place name called Yahweh. So he connects it to, though, some kind of proto or pre-Israelite idea. And that's what some others do too. In fact, there's this kind of Edomite hypothesis of Yahweh worship, that because of that inscription partially, that the Edomites actually invented or started worshiping Yahweh, and then the Israelites much later adopted that. But if we look at Edomite inscriptions and Edomite iconography and so forth, there's zero evidence of that. Their chief god was Kos. He was a warrior god. There's nothing about worshiping Yahweh in those early texts or even later ones. So another explanation is that it's a place name, right? But on that same column, there are other gods that are mentioned. And again, there is no known place name called Yahweh. So I think it's very difficult to explain away that particular inscription.
Yeah, it seems to me a pretty compelling one. I wanted to just ask you, because obviously the X from one region to another region, is there any connections with archaeological discovery discoveries in Judea regions, going back now to connect the stuff you're saying out of Egypt with discoveries we have of the Israelites in the modern day Israel. Connection there.
Yeah, that would belong more in the conquest and settlement period. So in that case, we would look at various archaeological sites where books like Joshua or Judges say that the Israelites destroyed or took over or settled or established a new settlement. And that would be a whole another topic. But yes, there is archaeology that connects to that period and those events also. And then of course, after the conquest period, kind of in the early settlement period, we start to see some interesting things in the archaeological record at many of the sites that archaeologists typically would associate with Israelite identity. Things like specific types of pottery, and the collared rim storage jar is one that's talked about a lot. The 4-room Israelite house, so a specific architectural plan that is found throughout Israel from the settlement period until the Babylonian conquest. The lack of pig bones at sites, connecting to the Mosaic law prohibition on pigs. Now the Canaanites, the Philistines, etc., they ate lots of pigs, so it is another distinguishing marker. We could also add into that a lack of temples, shrines, and even idols. Now later on, we start to see more idols popping into use, like in the 8th century BC during the divided kingdom period. But earlier on, we don't see that. And we really don't see temples in different cities. Yes, there are some cases like the Arad high place, sort of a temple shrine, but it's not normal. But if we go to Canaanite sites, we see that in all their cities, they're having these temples and shrines. So there are a few markers of Israelite identity that we start to see in that settlement period.
Excellent. I came across some of it was done by a guy by the name, an archaeology guy by the name of Adam Zert, and a altar that was discovered. What do you think of his that he's discovered Jewish altar, Joshua's altar? What do you think of Zertel's work?
Yeah, I think it's possible. That one it's kind of difficult, and there's a lot of different ideas about it, but it does seem like it could have been an altar or a high place that was up there even as early as the time of Joshua, up on Mount Gerizim there, or Mount Ebal, excuse me. So I would say possibly might need a bit more research and excavation to conclude that, but it seems like it could be. And you know, he did a lot of archaeological work all over the country, certainly knew what he was talking about. He wasn't just making up crazy stuff. So when he says things, it's worth looking into.
Excellent. I just wanted to ask you, because we're kind of coming to the end for this first session. Maybe if you could give us what you would think are recommended resources for the audience in terms of, introduction to biblical archaeology, and then maybe perhaps a recommended text. If you could maybe recommend those to our audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so some of the books that I typically use in my classes or I recommend as introductory texts include Archaeology of the Old Testament by Alfred Hirth. Actually, I've got some of these here. I'll show you. So, Archaeology of the Old Testament. This is a good introductory text on Old Testament archaeology. There's some areas where he doesn't get into as much detail, but it's a pretty good overview. And then for the New Testament, Archaeology in the New Testament by John McCrae. This is also a good overview text. He gets into more details. It's a little bit more difficult to read than the other, but it's quite good. And then you have Kenneth Kitchens on the reliability of the Old Testament. You've got some more specialized books like Hoffmeyer's Israel and Egypt, Ancient Israel and Sinai, that gets into some of these Exodus questions. Also, I mentioned my book on artifacts of the Bible. Again, just on artifacts, not on sites in this text. And then I've got the new book coming out on the archaeology of Jesus. So, I say you could take a few books and get a lot of information out of there. Of course, there's videos available too if people like watching those better. One that I would recommend actually.
Yeah, and
yeah, go ahead.
Carry on. The videos, or there's some that you would recommend, or potential organizer. Dan Wallace has got his Center for New Testament. What are some good Bible archaeology groups organized that are doing some good work? Do you have some rest on that front?
Yeah, there's a show called Digging for Truth that basically every episode they look at a new archaeological issue or location or event or person, and they have a lot of different archaeologists who appear on that show. So that's one I would recommend. There's the show Drive Through History, which goes on location to a lot of the biblical sites. And then there's another show called Bible Unearthed, which is kind of like an introductory course to biblical archaeology, and it's got some on location components of that. So there's a few that I could think of off the top of my head.
Okay, and then maybe just in closing, we have a wee break because we've got you coming up for a second session a little bit now. I won't stop this session, but maybe just if you could perhaps comment for us on what role do you think archaeology and this can play in the life of Christians in terms of their faith and their personal relationship with Christ? I mean, I'm just interested to know what you think of that from your point of view. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, I see two primary uses. So first of all, which obviously connects with the mission of Ratio Christi, is looking at it from apologetic side, or what's evidence that shows that the Bible is reliable. So we've got hard evidence, facts, archaeological artifacts, sites, ancient texts, and so forth, confirming the Bible, both Old and New Testament. So that's one component of it. Maybe it's somebody's questioning their faith, or maybe there's somebody who's seeking to see if there's evidence out there, is the Bible worth reading? The other component I would say is that the illumination of the Bible, the illumination of the ancient text, that is, if you learn more about the ancient world of the Bible and the times of the Old and New Testament, it can help us to understand the Bible better, and also I think brings it to life more so. So you're not just reading like an abstract theological text, but you can really visualize and understand those times, those places, those people. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we're going to end the Exodus archaeology session now, and in 30 minutes, we will start the next session on the archaeology of Jesus. So we'll see you then.